In this video, we're going to be talking about what's often called Chinese alchemy, although there's some discussion in the literature about whether that's appropriate because the two practices are genuinely different in a number of ways, especially in the sort of theoretical background that they're drawing on. But as you'll see, there's a whole bunch of similarities that make that equation make some sense. So in this video, I'll just go through some of the features of the Chinese practice, and you can decide for yourself how appropriate it is to call it alchemy. I think the differences are real and numerous, but there's also some really striking similarities, especially in the goal state and some of the operations. And then I'll just finish off with an anecdote from somewhat more modern chemistry in the West, which I just think is adorable and lovely. Okay, so what's called Chinese alchemy is usually divided into two separate practices, Waidan and Neidan. So Waidan could be described as kind of external alchemy, and that's the preparation of either gold or an elixir of immortality. Neidan is rather internal alchemy. That is, it's still trying to get to the goal of perfect health and immortality, but through a series of sort of purely internal practices. In both, the goal is to kind of bring things back to their original purity and vitality. So we'll talk about Waidan first. So the exact origins of Waidan are not super clear. The first reliable references come about in around the 1st or 2nd century BCE. And the basic idea is that by preparing an elixir or generating some alchemical gold with which to make sort of drinking and eating vessels, you could achieve health and possibly immortality. So you'd make some special gold and make a cup out of it and then drink stuff out of the cup and then you'd become immortal. Or just make some pills or an elixir, eat the pills, and you'd become immortal. Okay. So a nice example of this, an early example is Li Shaojun, he lived somewhere in the 1st century BCE. And he was a traveling Fang, which is something like, roughly translates to alchemist, astrologer, magician, physician. It's a kind of general purpose term for those practices. And he made a living by traveling to the courts of various noble people and offering them advice on how to sort of extend their health and improve their lifespan, maybe offering them immortality. He didn't tell anybody when or where he was born, so his actual sort of origin story is unclear. But he was famous for going around and telling stories like he met an old man, like a 90-year-old guy in a bar, and he said, "Oh, I knew your grandfather. We practice archery at this place." And the old man was like, "Oh yeah, my grandfather did practice archery at that place," making it sound like he's hundreds of years old. Or he went when he visited his possibly most famous patron, the Emperor Wu of Han, he claimed to know when a certain bronze vessel used to be in a different room, and that bronze vessel actually had been in that different room like 200 years before. So he's going around creating the impression that although he looks about 50, he's got sort of good skin and good teeth, that he's actually hundreds of years old. So his best client seems to have been the Emperor Wu of Han, who's pictured here. We don't have a picture of Li Shaojun, but he's the 7th emperor of the Han dynasty. Li Shaojun made a couple of recommendations to the emperor about how to sort of improve his health. One of them is dietary and one of them is alchemical. The dietary one is a pretty common practice in sort of Taoist and Taoist health practices, which is called bigu. Bigu is the sort of dietary restriction. Usually it has to do with the restriction of grains. So you stop eating sort of rice and wheat and stuff like that, and this is supposed to improve your health. And that sounds to me a lot like a keto diet, and the effects of it sound like a keto diet. So they describe it being, the first couple of weeks you feel kind of bad, but after that you feel full of life and energy. I don't know. The other suggestion was that the emperor should do something more properly alchemical, which is to transmute some cinnabar into gold, and that would be the kind of elixir of immortality. So here's a little picture of cinnabar. Cinnabar is the kind of raw ore that you can derive mercury from. So this is just a quote from The Way of the Golden Elixir, an introduction to Taoist alchemy. So Li Shaojun told the emperor, "By making offerings to the stove, one can summon the supernatural beings. If one summons them, Cinnabar can be transmuted into gold. When gold has been produced and made into vessels for eating and drinking, one can prolong one's life. If one's life is prolonged, one will be able to meet the immortals of Penglay Island in the midst of the sea. When one has seen them and performed the Fang and Shen ceremonies, one will never die. The Yellow Emperor did just so. So the Yellow Emperor is a kind of mythical ancient emperor who is a paragon of wisdom. So he's recommending that the emperor do this transmutation of Cinnabar into gold. Okay, so what's that about? Specifically, making offerings to the stove. This is the first step. So to make an offering to the stove means something like the following. Okay, so just like in Western alchemy, it's understood that there's a kind of not just a purely physical, chemical aspect to the practice, but that the person themselves has got to be sort of purified and transformed at the same time that the physical matter is purified and transformed. So you go somewhere secluded. The process is something like you go somewhere secluded, maybe in the mountains, something like that. You perform some purification practices like ablutions. You wash your body, observe a set of moral precepts like you don't kill or you don't steal or lie or don't do sexual immorality, that kind of thing. You mark out a ritual space with some talismans called fu. Fu are sort of common practice in Taoism. And then in the center of that ritual space, you build a stove. Okay, and the stove is something like what's pictured here. There's a top and a bottom half, and they get kind of sealed together. Under the stove, you build a fire. You start this fire on a propitious day, like a day that's marked out in the calendar as particularly good. And you do a kind of set of prayers and invocations to the heavenly powers to get this thing to have a kind of spiritual energy behind it. Okay. So the stove is a sealed vessel. It's kind of crucible. There's a top and bottom half that are sealed together with mud. And in the stove are placed a variety of ingredients, one of which is Cinnabar, which contains mercury, or something called realgar, which contains arsenic sulfide, or hematite, which is a kind of iron oxide. So you'd put a combination of these ingredients into the stove, and then the fire underneath it is kept going for 2 periods of 9 days, so 18 days in total, and then the elixir is supposed to have sublimated off of the ores. That is, it'll sort of boil and become vapor and then sort of stick to the top of the stove. You let it cool for a day, and then you can crack it open. And then on the top half of the stove, so the bottom half will have the kind of like rocks left over. The top half will have this kind of these sublimated metals that have collected up, and you can remove with a feather some of this elixir. Some of the elixir is offered up as a sacrifice to the gods, and then you eat a little bit of it as well, with the idea of becoming immortal, or at least extending your life to the point where you can do the subsequent practices that would make you immortal. Okay, so I think there's a bunch of similarities here between this practice and Western alchemy. The ingredients are very similar. This is a lot like a distillation. It's not exactly distillation because you don't have the sort of second vessel that it's coming out of, but you're slowly heating this thing to get the higher boiling or lower boiling point parts of it to come out, and they sort of stick to the top. So there's that. There's the sort of basic Waidan alchemical practice. There's a bunch of other practices. So this is one of the sort of fanciest, highest brow ones. There's a bunch of practices that sound more practical. So Fang, who was an alchemist from the 1st century BCE, once again a woman in the history of science. So enjoy it while it lasts. It'll be over in a minute. I'm sorry about that. There's just not that many famous women in the history of science. So she was an alchemist, and she described a process to turn mercury into silver. Now, I don't know of any way that it's physically possible to actually turn mercury into silver, but here's a thing that you could do. So mercury is very, very good, and one of the reasons alchemists all over the world are interested in it is because mercury can dissolve other metals. So if you put a little chunk of gold in mercury, it dissolves into the mercury, or a little chunk of silver. So suppose you did something like the following. You took some silver ore, so here's some silver ore, and then you crush it up maybe and immerse it in mercury, separate out the liquid portion, and then boil the result for long, kind of long, slow way. The mercury would boil off. Open your windows. The mercury would boil off and leave you just silver. And what it would look like is that you turned mercury into silver, something like that. So, somewhat more practical technique than the pill for immortality, but certainly it demonstrates the kind of thing that alchemists would have been up to in China. That is the manipulation of things like ores into metals, using mercury to change the properties and work with various metals, that sort of thing. And of course, you can't talk about Waidan without mentioning gunpowder. The exact moment of its discovery is unclear, so there's no single person that it's generally attributed to. But the general consensus is that gunpowder was discovered by Waidan practitioners trying to find a pill for the immortality. I'm reminded here of a quote from one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, in a book called Small Gods. He says the following. That's why it's always worth having a few philosophers around the place. One minute it's all truth is beauty and beauty is truth, and does a tree falling in the woods make a sound if there's no one there to hear it? And just when you think they're going to start dribbling, one of them says, incidentally, putting a 30-foot parabolic reflector on a high place to shoot the rays of the sun at an enemy's ship would be a very interesting demonstration of optical principles. So do keep a couple philosophers around, even if it looks like they're not getting up to something. Once in a while, one of their ideas is going to be a real humdinger. And gunpowder seems like that. There's always been suspicion of things like alchemy, but once in a while they really come up with something potent, let's say. And gunpowder is an example of that. Okay, so that was just super brief intro to Waidan. I'll briefly talk about Neidan. That's the internal version of this. So it's likewise understood as a search for immortality of a sort. And it's likewise understood as a search for immortality via the transmutation of substances, transforming various substances. But in this case, the substances are all internal to the body, and the transformation is not achieved in a kind of, by heating something up for 18 days. It's by meditation and kind of internal practices. So the base materials used in Neidan are Jing, Qi, and Shen. That is, Jing is the kind of essence, Qi is the breath or energy, and they're used to produce Shen, that is spirit. So these substances are collected, let's say metaphorically, in various parts of the body, in the dantian. And the dantian literally translates to the Cinnabar fields. Remember Cinnabar, that mercury stuff? So these internal practices, these meditation practices, are understood at minimum as a metaphor through the metaphors of Waidan, the external alchemy. So in one version of this practice, there's a whole variety of versions of this practice, but in one version, Jing is collected in the lower dantian, the lower Cinnabar field, and then it's heated as though in an alchemical vessel, and it's sort of a pure version of it circulates through the body and is then used to transmute into higher and higher substances. So you transmute Jing into Qi and then Qi into Shen. One version of the ultimate goal of this is to create a spiritual body that lives on after death. So once enough of the Shen, the spirit, is sort of refined, it can be transmuted into a heavenly embryo. That is a spiritual embryo that kind of like develops in the body and then gets gestated for long enough and carefully enough that once you die, this kind of spiritual body that you generated lives on. I think that's probably important to know, because when you're asking about, the success or failure of a technique that's supposed to grant immortality, a really quick and easy test is, hey, where are all the immortals? Like, if your technique works, where are the people who have lived forever? And in this case, what they're talking about is not physical immortality, so they accept that the body dies. What they're talking about is a kind of spiritual immortality, that is, your spirit lives on after your death, if you've in some sense made yourself a soul using these internal alchemical practices. Okay, I think it's just interesting to note that the Western alchemical tradition, there's a similar idea that is of making a homunculus. Again, similar but very different. So in the Chinese alchemical and Neidan practice, you're building a soul, like you're building your own spirit body. In the Western tradition, the instructions are supposed to create what's called a homunculus, which is just like a little person. It's like a perfectly formed person, but little. And if you do it right, you're supposed to like generate life out of non-living matter. This is another one of these strange situations where these two traditions seem to come to similar-ish conclusions from very different starting points. Okay. Another really big similarity, I mean, we talked about the sort of similarity between the stove in Waidan and the distillation in Western alchemy. Another big similarity is the kind of crucial significance that both traditions put on mercury, sulfur, and gold. So mercury, sulfur, and gold are in both traditions understood as centrally important ingredients in this process. Make of that what you will. They have different physical theories underwriting their beliefs in the importance of these substances, but they all converge on the idea that these are the crucial ingredients. To finish this lecture off, I'm going to shift now from Chinese Waidan and Neidan and talk a little bit about some scientific revolution stuff in Europe, in England specifically. But I think that it's interesting to see what happens to this idea of mercury as a kind of crucial element in the search for the understanding the mysteries of life. Okay, so let's talk about Joseph Priestley. Joseph Priestley, he lives in the 18th century, and he's a kind of weird, curious sort of guy. He lived for a while near a brewery, right next door to a place where they were brewing beer. And his wife and children were complaining about the air. Like, this air sucks. I don't like this air. So he investigated. He tried to find out if there was something about the air coming off the brewery. And what he found was that, for example, if he goes up to these big vats where they're fermenting beer, if he lights a little piece of wood on fire and kind of puts it in the beer or near the surface of the beer, the fire goes out pretty quickly. So that's odd, right? And if you get some smoke on top of the beer and kind of mix it in with that air, that smoke will sink rather than rise. Usually smoke goes up, right? But if you mix smoke into the air just above the beer vats, that will sink. Okay, so he's interested in this. He's curious. This air, the fact that it sinks is useful because Priestley learns that he can capture it, right? So the air coming off these beer vats can be captured in a container, and it'll just sort of sit there in the container and do experiments with it. He discovered that that same type of air could be produced. So people were aware already, so he discovered the correspondence between what's called fixed air and what Priestley was calling mephitic air. So fixed air can be produced by pouring some what they called oil of vitriol, what we would call sulfuric acid, over limestone and water. So you get some limestone, you pour some sulfuric acid on it, and it'll produce fixed air, what we would call carbon dioxide. And Priestley discovered that he could mix this fixed air, or mephitic air was what he was calling it, with water and produce carbonated beverages. So he was the first guy to produce, bubbly water. It occurs naturally, and of course beer is naturally bubbly, but Priestley was the first one to come up with artificially carbonated beverages. Okay, that's not the point of the story. So people at this point knew that if you put an animal, like a mouse, in some air that has been exhausted by a candle, it'll pretty quickly die. So you get a sealed vessel, you put a candle in it, let it burn till it goes out, and then put an animal in there, the animal will very quickly pass out. Priestley tried putting some plants in exhausted air, kind of expecting that they would do the same, that they would just sort of quickly wilt and die. But he found, he put a mint plant in some exhausted air, and he found that it actually did just fine, thank you very much. And even weirder, when he opened up the vessel that this mint plant had been sitting in, it didn't, usually fixed air or mephitic air will put a candle out really quickly. This stuff, the candle would burn just fine. So something had sort of revivified the air. This was the beginning of the discovery that the stuff that we breathe in is the stuff that plants breathe out, and vice versa. So this is him on the road to figuring that part out. Now, the terms that I'm using, mephitic air, fixed air, we of course call this stuff carbon dioxide and oxygen. Those names hadn't been applied yet, and they didn't have an understanding of the kind of elemental chemistry behind it. But in a absolutely lovely kind of historical coincidence, and this is the point that I'm trying to get to, that I think would have really pleased those old alchemists, was that Priestley was the first person to isolate oxygen, and he used mercury to do it. So here's the experiment where he first isolated oxygen. So take what's called a calx of mercury, CALX, a calx, which is what we would call mercury oxide. So some elemental mercury bonded to some oxygen, basically rusted mercury. And you put that in a sealed vessel and then point just a really big magnifying glass at it. So heat it up with a really big magnifying glass, a burning lens they would call it, which was a kind of common tool in the chemical experiments of the day. And adding heat to mercuric oxide liberates the oxygen. So, you burn this stuff with, or you not burn it, but like sort of the opposite of burning it. You put a bunch of heat into it and it gives off a bunch of oxygen, which he could then collect. And Priestley, being the curious guy that he was, he breathed this stuff. So he's like, oh, I got a bunch of gas coming off my calx of mercury. I better breathe it and see what it does. So he tried a bunch of stuff. So he found that candles burned really brightly when exposed to this gas. He found that animals live just fine in it. So you seal a mouse in with some of this gas that come off it, they live great. And he breathed it himself. He's, oh, this stuff is great. Pure oxygen feels great. He didn't call it oxygen, but he noticed that this stuff was just amazing. So I think that that's really just a lovely bit of kind of historical poetry almost. The facts themselves seem to present to us a little bit of historical poetry, because the experiments that led, so Priestley didn't think of it in terms of oxygen. The person who eventually does describe it that way is Lavoisier, a French chemist. But the experiments that led to Lavoisier identifying oxygen, and ultimately to the identification of this cycle between plants and animals, where we breathe out CO2 and they breathe it in, and they breathe out oxygen and we breathe that in, came from this experiment. This experiment was sort of crucial to the discovery of this cycle, and it was mercury at the heart of it. So I think it's just lovely that mercury that had been investigated by alchemists for millennia turns out to have been one of the keys to understanding maybe not individual immortality, but how we all as a biosphere can keep living in this sort of symbiotic cycle. So I think that's just lovely.